The seawall of Marin does not announce itself. There are no signs, no markers at the approach, no beacons to guide you toward its face. The survey archives do not describe it as a monument, though it is. They classify it as an infrastructure system, a coastal defense structure, tidal management installation. Technically accurate. Like calling the ocean a water feature. The truth is that there is nothing else on the Earth, anywhere else humanity has put its hands in, that looks like the seawall. Nothing that carries the same weight in the same silence. I have worked along its surface for 19 years, and there are still mornings when I come up through the maintenance lifts and stand at the crest, rail and feel something close to terror. Not of the seawall, of what it means that we were patient enough to build it. My name is Adeza Nwosu. Formal title is Senior Integration Engineer, Marin Coastal Continuity Division, 3rd deployment cycle. What that actually means, anyone who has never worked a megastructure post, is that I am one of roughly 400 people responsible for the living systems embedded in an 800-kilometer span of the seawall's northern face. The thermal exchangers, the tidal conversion arrays, the atmosphere processors that run along the upper crown from the Farsant anchor to the Cape Marin terminus, maintains the systems that keep the seawall running. I also maintain the panels. That is not in my formal title. I do it anyway. The panels are what most people come to see, when they come at all. Tourists approach from the water, on glass-hulled ferries, and the seawall rises ahead of them at a scale that the human eye cannot resolve all at once. A cliff face of engineered stone and bonded composite that runs from the sea floor to a crown, more than 2 kilometers above mean sea level, stretching east and west until it vanishes in the atmospheric haze, and set into that face at every elevation. In every material the builders had access to are the panels, millions of them. Some are meters wide, some are the size of a door, some run in bands 30 meters tall and hundreds of meters long, carved directly into the structural composite, their lettering in scripts that were ancient when the seawall was begun, and in languages that came later, trained that were invented during the long centuries of building, that belonged to peoples who were born on the seawall's construction platforms, and died there, and were remembered in new panels their children commissioned. The panels record everything, not selected things, everything. 1,400 years to build the seawall. It has been standing for another 118,600 years since the last stone was set. The engineers who finished it were the 47th generation of a building program that was begun by people who would not live to see it completed, who knew they would not live to see it completed, and who built it anyway with the precision and care of people who intended to last. I think about that sometimes when I am running diagnostic checks on a section of tidal exchanger housing, and I look up and see a panel 500 meters overhead, too far to read, catching the morning light at an angle that turns its lettering briefly gold. 1,400 years to build, and they still got the tolerances right. It was a morning like that. Early, the autumn light coming in low from the northeast, the sea slate gray and quiet below the access platform. When the Ascendancy fleet arrived, I knew before the general alarm. The deep sky monitoring system feeds to a summary display in every engineering station on the seawall, and I had been watching the contact signatures accumulate in the outer approach corridors for 6 hours by the time the first Priority 1 notification pushed through to the whole installation network. In this work, you develop habits around secondary systems. You check the things that other people forget to check. The contacts had been organizing themselves in a pattern I recognized from the military architecture modules we all have to certify on. A convergence approach, not a transit corridor, not a random dispersion. They were coming here. They had been coming here for a very long time, on a heading that did not deviate by so much as an arcsecond over the full 6 hours I watched it. 61 ships. The Ascendancy fleet carried religious designation markings on its hull profiles. I only know this because the contact analysis system flags it automatically. Cross-referencing against a threat classification library that is far older than my posting here, far older than my grandmother's posting here, far older than any living person's memory of when those markings were first logged and categorized and stored in a system that was designed to still be running when they came back. The library had an entry. It had always had an entry. Someone, very long time ago, had made sure of that. The markings identified the fleet as belonging to the Veth Ascendancy, a religious military order whose home authority lay in a system 11 light-years from Earth, whose founding doctrine described this world as the seated ground. Deepest theology held that everything living on Earth had been placed here by their first prophets, intentionally, as an act of divine cultivation. They had left, according to their own historical records that humanity had possessed for considerably longer than the Ascendancy seemed to understand. Approximately 120,000 years ago, they had not returned, not once, not in all that time, until this morning. I put down my diagnostic stylus and pulled up the panel archive on my secondary display. Not because I needed to find anything. I have the archive memorized in the sections I maintain, and a working familiarity with the full northern face going back 3 postings. I pulled it up because I needed to hold something steady in my hands, while I thought about what 61 ships crossing the outer approach meant, and the panel archive is the steadiest thing I know. The first entry in the archive, timestamped to the 73rd year of the seawall's construction, reads, "We build this for what comes back." 7 words. The builders who commissioned that panel had already decided, before the foundation courses were finished, that this structure was not only for the sea. They were patient that way, the founders, patient in a way that is almost impossible to fully hold in one human lifetime. So we build it into the stone instead, and we make sure the stone lasts. The Priority 1 alert resolved into a more detailed operational picture over the next hour. The Defense Coordination Authority had been tracking the Ascendancy fleet since it entered the outer system. They had, in fact, been tracking it since it entered the inner approach corridor 4 months prior, and they had said nothing publicly because there was nothing useful to say yet, and because the protocols for this kind of contact have been standing orders for so long that the current coordination authority inherited them from predecessors who never expected to use them, who had inherited them from predecessors who also never expected to use them, going back so many generations that the standing orders themselves had been rewritten from scratch twice and substantially revised 11 times, while the underlying intent remained unchanged. The intent was simple. When they come back, do not flinch. Show them what we have become. Let them make a decision. I have been asked, in the months since, whether I felt afraid when I saw the contact signatures organizing themselves on Deep Sky display. It is a reasonable question, and I want to give it an honest answer. What I felt in the first minutes was not fear. It was something colder and more specific than fear. A form of recognition. The monitoring system had flagged the approach pattern as consistent with the Veth Ascendancy profile, and knowing that name, understanding what that name meant in the context of this installation and this record. I felt what you feel when something you told about your entire professional life and have treated as theoretical suddenly becomes actual. Surprise. The opposite of surprise. The particular sensation of a prediction being confirmed after a wait so long it had ceased to feel like waiting and had become simply the shape of how things were. The seawall is built for many things. It manages tidal systems along 800 kilometers of coastline. It generates a significant fraction of the northern coastal grid's power through its tidal arrays. It processes a volume of atmosphere that would otherwise be degraded by the thermal differentials between the North Atlantic's warming patterns and the old landmass. These are practical functions. They are real and they matter. The founders, who began it in the 73rd year of construction, were also doing something else, something they were deliberate about, even if they did not use the language I am using now. They were making an argument that takes a very specific form. Not words, not claims, not declarations of strength or warnings of consequence, but existence, duration. The argument of a thing that is still here and is still running, and has been here and running longer than the people who question its right to be here have been watching. You cannot argue with the seawall. It does not argue. It endures. That is different, and it is better. My supervisor, a rangy Kenyan man named O.C., who had been at the Marin installation for 30 years, and had the particular stillness of someone who has worked a very large, very old thing long enough to take its scale into himself, came to find me in the exchanger corridor about 90 minutes after the general alert. The crown platform is being opened for observation, he said. All non-essential maintenance is suspended. Essential maintenance. You can go up if you want. I looked at him. Are you going up? I've been up since the alert, he said. I needed to walk the primary thermal array and think. That was OC. 30 years on the seawall, and his response to an incoming alien fleet was to walk the thermal array and think. I followed him up. The crown platform runs along the full crest of the seawall, promenade, that is not quite a fortification and not quite a public overlook, but something in between, wide enough for the maintenance vehicles to pass each other, railed on the seaward edge. Open to the sky, with a view east and west along the seawall's spine and north across open ocean. On a clear morning you can see the thermal haze rising off the exchanger arrays below, and, if the angle is right and the light is clean, the faint lines of the next installation segment curving away into the distance, following the old coastline. Today there were people all along the crown, standing at the seaward rail or sitting on the equipment housings, or clustered in quiet groups near the maintenance sheds. No one was talking much. There was a particular quality to the silence, not tense, not afraid, not the held breath silence of people waiting for something bad. It was the silence of people who have been given an enormous piece of information and are very carefully, very quietly integrating it. I went to the seaward rail and looked north. The fleet was still in high atmosphere, visible as a pattern of lights in the late morning sky, too far for shape or detail but unmistakable in formation. 61 distinct contacts in a layered approach pattern, descending very slowly. The defense coordination vessels were in position around them. 14 human warships of the long-range deterrent class, each one roughly 4 kilometers from stem to stern, their silhouettes crossing the sky, like slow geometric facts, blotting out portions of cloud when they passed. They had not taken firing position. They were flying escort formation. The Ascendancy fleet was being guided in, not turned back. OC stood beside me with his hands in his coat pockets. He had a cup of tea that he had somehow produced from somewhere. He looked at the sky for a long time without speaking. They're going to come down to the water, he finally said. It wasn't a question. That's what the protocols say, I confirmed. The designated approach point for a Veth Ascendancy contact is the Marin Basin, this installation, the northern face. He thought about that. Whoever wrote that protocol chose well. They had 120,000 years to think about it, I said. He looked at me sideways and said nothing, and sipped his tea. The descent took most of the morning. The Ascendancy fleet moved with the caution of people who are not certain what the rules are, coming down through the cloud layers in a formation that stayed tight but not aggressive. The kind of arrangement that says we are not here to fight, we are here to arrive, and we are very aware of the things around us in the sky. The human warships maintained their positions throughout, holding the corridor. Not crowding, not retreating. There, I went back to my maintenance work for several hours. There was actual work to do. The tidal exchanger on panel cluster 740 had been running 3% below efficiency for 2 weeks, and the diagnostic trace had narrowed it to a seal housing that needed physical inspection. And the fact that 61 alien ships were descending through our atmosphere did not change the seal housing. OC had said, "Your essential maintenance." He meant it. The seawall ran during the construction, during the storms, during the 3 great conflicts humanity had survived in the centuries after it was finished. It would run today. I was inside an access tunnel, crouched in front of the seal housing, with a calibration tool and a headlamp, when the radio carried the first intercept of the Ascendancy's broadcast. They had begun transmitting as they descended, a religious frequency, a broadcast in the Veth liturgical dialect, which our translation systems handle without difficulty. Because we have been studying Veth language and theology for a very long time. The content was what you might expect from a religious fleet returning after 120 years to a world their doctrine described as the seeded ground. Sacred language, proclamations of return, claims of divine stewardship over all life on earth, issued in the formal register that their theology reserved for the restoration of holy sites. They spoke of the long absence as a period of consecrated patience. They had been away tending the seeded ground from a distance, spiritually, prayer and observance. They had returned now because the sacred calendar said it was time. Their holy texts described this moment. The return of tending, they called it. The restoration of the gardeners to the garden. They were completely calm. That was the detail that stayed with me as I worked on the seal housing. Completely, utterly calm. The way you are calm when you have rehearsed something so many times that you no longer have any doubt about how it goes. I thought about that while I coaxed the seal housing into alignment and ran the calibration check. The ascendancy had been gone 120,000 years. In their theological framework, they had been tending this world spiritually for all that time. They had come back now because their calendar told them to. They were expecting, what? A world that had been waiting, quietly, for the gardeners to return. Perhaps a world that had not developed much further than when they left. Perhaps a world that would need tending, that would benefit from Veth guidance, that would recognize in them the authority their doctrine had described. The calibration check came back green. The seal housing was holding. I packed my tools and backed out of the access tunnel into the main corridor. My radio was still carrying the translation feed. The Ascendancy's broadcast was becoming slightly less calm. Not alarmed, not yet, but there was a quality in the liturgical register that the translation system flagged as unexpected contextual data is being processed. I understood that. They were looking at the seawall. Let me try to describe what the Ascendancy saw as their fleet came down through the last cloud. Layer and the Marin coast resolved below them. The seawall from the air is not like the seawall from the water or from the crown. From the water you see the face, the scale of it, the panels, the way it rises, and keeps rising until the crest vanishes into atmosphere haze. From the crown you see the breadth of it, the long engineering of it, the way it manages to be both massive and precise at once. From the air, from directly above, coming down through clouds at an angle that gives you the full sweep of the northern coast. You see it as a line that stretches from east to west across the visible horizon, perfectly continuous, 800 kilometers of it within immediate view, and more of it beyond the curve of the Earth. And that line is not inert. It moves. The thermal exchangers cycle in visible patterns. The tidal arrays produce surface turbulence in the sea at their bases that is visible from orbit. Crown installations have enough metal surface that they catch the sun in shifting silver sequences as the light angle changes. Then the resolution improves as they descend further, and they begin to see the panels. I have tried to imagine, in the years since that morning, what it looks like to see the panels for the first time when you have not been raised with them, when you do not carry in your body the accumulated understanding of what they are. Each panel is legible. Once you are close enough, specific text, specific record, specific date, specific notation. But the first impression, from the air, before you are close enough to read any individual line, is different from legibility. What you see is density, coverage, a face that is not blank stone but is written on, entirely written on, sea level to crest, in every language that has ever been spoken on this world, in lettering that ranges from the monumental to the intimate, in materials that range from the original cast composite to bronze, to reclaimed steel, to a polymer that the 41st generation of builders developed specifically because it would outlast everything else they had available. The face is a record. You see that from the air before you can read a word. A record of something, a very long record, written by people who intended it to be read by whoever came next, whoever came back, whoever finally arrived. The Ascendancy broadcast went quiet for a little while. Not the end of transmission. The carrier signal continued, but the proclamation stopped. I was back at my main station by then, running post-inspection diagnostics on the seal housing repair and monitoring the contact summary display. I watched Ascendancy fleet finish its descent and take up a hovering position off the northern face, roughly 2 kilometers out over the water, crest elevation. In good atmospheric conditions that put the lead ship roughly level with the upper panel bands. The long ones, the 300-year record bands, the ones that run in horizontal sequences the width of a city block, the ones that are legible from 2 kilometers with any decent optics at all. OC came back to the engineering station a little before noon. He pulled up a chair and sat down without speaking and looked at the contact display with me for a while. "They've been stationary for 40 minutes, I said. "They're reading," he said. That was exactly what they were doing. The translation system, picking up everything the fleet's internal communications were producing, confirmed it. The Ascendancy's lead liturgists and scholars were in active session, cross-referencing what they were reading on the panels against their own theological archives, against their historical records, against the doctrine that underpinned their understanding of what Earth was and what their relationship to it meant. The cross-referencing was not going smoothly. There is a particular quality to a translation system's output when the source material is cycling through increasing states of alarm. Not the words themselves, not yet, but the cadence, the rate of transmission, the interruptions, the way a phrase gets started and cut off and started again. The scholars of the Veth Ascendancy were very learned people, confronting information that their learning had not prepared them for. I thought about what they were reading. The panels on the seawall begin, as I said, in the 73rd year of construction, roughly 800 years before the morning the Ascendancy arrived. They begin with the foundational notation, the names of the first builders, the materials specifications, the projected completion date, which was famously wrong by about 300 years because no one adequately modeled complexity of the northern anchor systems. Then the record expands. The builders added everything. Every generation added everything. Wars and their outcomes. Famines and how they were resolved. Technologies developed, tested, failed, revised, succeeded. The deaths of the notable and the deaths of the ordinary, interleaved without hierarchy. Because the panel commission that governed notation in the 2nd century of construction decided that the seawall should not distinguish between the historically important and the historically invisible, that if the purpose was to record what humanity was, then the record should be honest, and honest meant complete. Complete meant everything. The Ascendancy's arrival in the approach corridor 120,000 years ago is on the panels. Course it is. The encounter between the first Veth scouts and the early builders of the seawall is a well-documented, carefully recorded event. It appears in the panel record in 4 languages, from 4 different perspectives, including a first-person account from one of the builders who spoke with a Veth representative and asked, in plain language, why they were leaving and when they planned to return. The Veth representative's answer, recorded in its original form, without translation or annotation, is also there. "We have it. We have always had it." The Veth representative said, in what was then a standard liturgical formula, "When the calendar calls the gardeners home, the gardeners return." The builders wrote it down, because they wrote everything down. Because they understood, in a way that 120,000 years has only confirmed, what you write down is what survives. What the Ascendancy scholars were now reading, in sequence, was the record of everything that happened on Earth after they left, every year, every generation, every turn. Thing they had called the seeded ground, the place they had considered a garden in a state of benign suspension, had not been in suspension. It had been building, it had been learning, it had been recording. It had created an infrastructure so large that it had altered the local climate, patterns of an entire coastline. It had developed a language of structural endurance and passed it down, unbroken, for 118,600 years. It had built the seawall in 1,400 years of continuous labor. And it had maintained the seawall in the centuries since. It had embedded in the seawall's face a complete and unambiguous record of exactly who humanity was, what humanity had done, and what humanity had become. So that when the gardeners finally returned, there would be no ambiguity, no gap, no possibility of misunderstanding. Just the record, which was the truth, which was always the answer to anyone who came back, thinking they understood what they would find. The panels contained, specifically, that I think hit the Ascendancy scholars hardest was this. The record does not describe humanity as defined by the Veth's departure or shaped by the expectation of their return. That is, what is most devastating about it. If you approach it from the Ascendancy's theological framework, their doctrine described Earth as a garden tended spiritually from a distance, A world held in gentle cultivation by the Ascendancy's ongoing sacred attention. The panels make clear, without editorializing, without argument, that Earth had been doing no such waiting. The generations recorded in the seawall did not spend their lives oriented toward the Ascendancy or toward the prospect of their return. They were oriented toward each other, toward the problems immediately in front of them, toward the next generation and what that generation would need, toward the work. The panels record the full texture of a civilization that developed independently, that made its own errors and corrected them, that built its own institutions and revised them, that developed its own cosmologies and philosophical traditions that have nothing to do with the Veth theology and never did. The Ascendancy had believed they were watching over something. The panels make clear that the something was not thinking about them at all. There is a section of the record, spanning about 200 years in the fourth millennium of the seawall's construction, that documents the period when humanity first developed the capacity to detect signals in the frequency range the Ascendancy uses for long-range communication. The record notes, without drama, that no signals consistent with the known Veth communication profile were detected. The notation continues to appear in the record at irregular intervals for the next several thousand years, not obsessively, not with anxiety, simply as a factual entry in the ongoing log of what was observed. Not detected, not detected, not detected. And then, a long span of years in which the notation does not appear at all, because the people keeping the record had reached a generation that had never expected to detect anything, and had moved on, and continued building, and continued recording. And the seawall kept running, and the panels kept accumulating, and the work continued, in the way that work continues, when it is built into the structure of a people, rather than depending on any individual's resolve. I did not think about fear. I thought about those generations. About the people who kept the notation going for 1,000 years and then stopped, not because they had given up, because they had absorbed the absence into the fabric of ordinary life and kept moving. That is not defeat. That is the specific discipline of people who understood that the work was not contingent on anyone's return. The Defense Coordination Authority opened the first formal communication channel with the Ascendancy lead vessel at 1300 hours, Standard Marin local time. I have the transcript. I have read it many times. It is not dramatic. That is what strikes me about it every time, how undramatic it is. The human lead coordinator, a composed woman named Eula Okafor-Schenk, who holds a joint commission in defense, coordination and diplomatic continuity, introduced herself and her authority in the formal contact register, and informed the Ascendancy Fleet commander that Earth welcomed the Ascendancy's return and invited them to continue reviewing the public record available on the seawall's northern face, and that when they were ready to receive a formal contextual briefing, Earth's Diplomatic Continuity Service was prepared to provide one. Not a threat, not a welcome soaked in sarcasm. Just the plain, measured language of a people who had been waiting for exactly this, and had their ready. The Ascendancy Fleet Commander's response took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of silence on the open channel while, presumably, the commander sat with his scholars and his advisors and tried to find a frame for what was happening. Then the response came, and it was also not dramatic. The commander confirmed receipt of the communication and agreed to a contextual briefing, and requested that the briefing address specifically the nature and extent of the panel record, visible on the coastal installation. He used a very careful phrase. He said, "We wish to understand what we are reading." Osi, who was standing beside me when that came through the translation feed, made a quiet sound. Not a laugh. Something smaller and older than a laugh. I looked at him. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said. He wasn't talking to me. That's been the question all along. The contextual briefing was not my work. That belongs to diplomatic continuity, who have specialists for exactly this, who have been running preparation exercises for exactly this encounter in their current institutional form, about 300 years, and in earlier institutional forms going back considerably further. What I can tell you is what I saw from the Crown platform in the late afternoon, after the briefing had been underway for several hours, and the light was coming in at the low angle that makes the panel lettering cast shadows, and go suddenly legible from distances where you normally can't read a word. The lead ascendancy vessel had moved closer to the face, was hovering at 400 meters out now, at mid-elevation, in a position that put it opposite one of the long record bands, specifically, the band that covers the 2 centuries surrounding the seawall's completion, period, when the 47th generation of builders set the final stones, and then, according to the record, sat down at the base of the structure they had been raised inside and wept, not from grief, from the specific action of people who had finished something that their great-great-great-grandparents had started, something they had been told their whole lives they might live to finish, and had in fact lived to finish, not fully processed the reality of having done so. The record uses the specific word. It says, relief, not triumph, relief. I watched the lead vessel hover there. I watched the seawall hold its position, as it has held its position for 118,600 years, without apology or announcement, without asking to be noticed. I thought about the people who built it, and the people who maintained it, and the people who decided, before the foundation was even poured, that this was what Earth would do with the time it had been given. Not retreat, fortify in the military sense. Record, endure, build something that spoke for itself, something that could not be talked around or misread or dismissed, something that said, simply by existing, we were here, we were this, we did this, and we have been doing it for longer than you have been watching. The full briefing lasted 3 days. I spent most of those days doing my job. The SEAL housing on Cluster 740 needed follow-up monitoring, and there were 2 sections of upper crown thermal exchange housing that had been showing anomalous temperature differentials since a storm system 3 weeks earlier. The seawall does not pause for significant events. This is, when you think about it, its most important quality. It has never paused. It will not pause. The work continues because the work is the point. On the second evening after my shift, I went back to the crown platform. The Ascendancy fleet was still in position over the water, though several of the smaller vessels had repositioned since the first day, moving along the northern face at low altitude, very slowly, in what I can only describe as reading speed. Moving along the record the way you move through an archive when you have realized the archive is not what you expected and you need to start from the beginning and go carefully. I watched one of the smaller Ascendancy vessels, a courier-class ship, probably carrying scholars rather than military personnel, built for endurance rather than engagement, moving at perhaps 10 kilometers per hour, along the lower panel bands, its hull running lights casting a faint warm reflection on the seawall's face below it. It would stop sometimes, 20 or 30 minutes at one section before moving on. I could not see what it was reading from where I stood. I did not need to. I knew the lower panel bands at that elevation in that section of the northern face well enough to work from memory. Section covers the early agricultural consolidation period, roughly 9,000 years into the seawall's history, period of significant expansion of the northern coastal installations. The notation style in that section reflects a particular generation of record keepers who were trained under a philosophy that said the panel record should not only document events, but should document the reasoning behind decisions. Not just what was done, but why. Not just that a particular material was chosen for the panel substrate, but what alternatives were considered, and why the chosen material was preferred. It is one of the most detailed and methodical sections of the entire record. I have always found it calming to read, in the way that detailed methodical work from people who care deeply about accuracy is always calming to read. Courier-class ship hovered there for almost 40 minutes. It was a clear evening, cold, the star field overhead beginning to resolve as the last daylight left. I stood at the seaward rail and looked at the Ascendancy vessels, and the seawall face and the long reflection of both in the flat water below. There is a thing you carry when you work a place long enough. It is not sentimentality. I am not a sentimental person, and the seawall does not encourage sentimentality. It is too large for that, too ancient, too plainly the product of successive generations of practical engineering, rather than a single sublime vision. You carry is something more like memory by proxy. The panels are not my memories, but I maintain them, and maintaining them has made me fluent in them. The way you become fluent in a language you use every day without thinking. I know what they say. I know where particular records are located and what they document, and what the notation style tells you about when and why they were added. I know the section around kilometer 420 where the notation suddenly changes in the mid-3rd century period, where a commission that had been using a very formal civic record register shifted into something more plain-spoken and immediate. And the scholars believe it's caused because a plague passed through the construction platforms that year, and the people who survived it came back to the panels and found that the formal register no longer felt honest. They wrote plainly after that. They wrote the way people write when they have stopped caring what it sounds like, and have started caring only that it is accurate. I thought about those builders a lot on that second evening, about what it means to decide that accuracy matters more than appearance, about the particular kind of patience that requires, not the patience of waiting for something, but the patience of making something that you will not see the end of, knowing that what matters is whether it is true, not whether it is complete in your lifetime. The Veth ascendancy had come back expecting to find the garden. They had found instead the gardeners. Not the gardeners they thought, not the waiting, cultivated life forms of their theology, preserved in careful simplicity for 120,000 years of spiritual tending from a distance. They had found something that had been tending itself. Something that had developed, in the absence of any external guidance, the particular quality that makes the seawall possible, the understanding that what you leave behind is who you are, and that you have an obligation to the people who come after you to leave them something true. On the morning of the 4th day, the Ascendancy Fleet's lead vessel broadcast a formal transmission that the translation system classified as theological revision in progress, pending doctrinal review. In plain language, they were rewriting something. Counter with the panel record had required them to revise their understanding of what Earth was, and what the Ascendancy's relationship to it meant. They were not finished revising it. They might never finish revising it. Theological revisions of that magnitude tend to take generations, and the Ascendancy was smart enough to know it. But they had begun. The fleet commander made a personal request that afternoon to visit the seawall, directly, not in a vessel but on foot, on the Crown platform, in a meeting with Earth's diplomatic continuity representatives. Request was granted. A formal diplomatic delegation landed on the Crown platform via shuttle. 6 Ascendancy representatives, including the fleet commander and 2 senior scholars, and were met by Coordinator Okafor Schenk and 4 members of her continuity team and cause installation access. Certification covers the Crown platform, and I happened to be running a maintenance check on the upper thermal housing at the time, and was therefore already there me. I will be honest about what the Veth look like, because the records I maintain are supposed to be accurate, and that commitment extends to this account. They are tall, 2.5 meters, approximately. Their body structure is bilateral and roughly humanoid, in the sense that they have limbs and a distinct head, but the similarity stops there. The integument is a deep, dark auburn with a faint iridescent quality, not the iridescence of feathers or scales, but something more like the surface of a very old oil painting, where the pigment has dried in a way that catches different wavelengths of light, depending on the angle. Their facial structure suggests significant sensory capability. Large, deeply set visual organs with horizontal pupils, broad olfactory apparatus, audio reception structures that sit above and behind the visual organs, and are in nearly constant subtle motion. They dressed in formal attire that I was told later represented the Ascendancy's highest ceremonial register. Layered structural garments in dark colors, with panels of text worked into the fabric. Their own tradition of writing things into surfaces. Their own version of the record, worn on the body rather than carved into stone. I found that detail striking. We were more alike in that than I had expected. The fleet commander's name, transliterated, was something like Vale Tharun Keth. The hyphened form indicating a doubled lineage, which the briefing materials told me, was a high honor in Ascendancy culture. Commander Vale Tharun Keth stood at the seaward rail of the Crown platform and looked at the northern face of the seawall for a very long time, before saying anything. When he spoke, The translation came through the earpiece I was wearing, flat and faithful, in the way machine translation always is, stripped of whatever music or weight the original register carries, but accurate. He said something that the translation rendered as, "We believed the garden kept itself because we were watching. We did not ask what it would do if we looked away." Coordinator Okafor Schenk said quietly, "It kept itself because it chose to." Bail Thorun Keth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The record goes back to before the wall." She told him it did. He said, "Where?" She told him there were underground archive systems that predated the seawall by several thousand years. Earlier record-keeping traditions that the seawall had incorporated and expanded, going back to a period before unified record-keeping, where the records existed in distributed forms in dozens of separate archive sites across the old continents. She told him that all of those earlier archives were still intact, still maintained, still legible. She told him that the diplomatic continuity team would be happy to arrange access to whatever historical period he wished to study. He was very still for a while after that. Not the stillness of a person who has nothing to say. The stillness of a person who is carrying something too large to put down and too important to drop. Running my thermal housing check and was not supposed to be listening. But the crown platform is not large and I have good ears. I heard him say in a quieter register that the translation earpiece almost missed. They were here. They were always here. We told our children they were sleeping. And Okafor Schenk said very gently, in a tone I have not heard her use in any of the subsequent archived transmissions of that encounter, they were never sleeping. They were just not done yet. There is a panel near kilometer 660, not in the monumental zone, not in one of the famous record bands, just a mid-elevation working panel from about 11,000 years into the seawall's history, added by a woman whose name the record gives in 4 forms, corresponding to the 4 naming traditions active in that region at that time. Panel is not physically remarkable. It is about 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall. Its surface a medium-weight composite that has aged well, the lettering in a script that was widespread for about 300 years before it was absorbed into the consolidated notation system. What the panel says is simple. I have read it many times. It says, "Whatever you are when you read this, you were built here." That is not a debt. It is not a burden. It is only the truth of where things come from, is a truth we have found it better to know than to forget. The people who set these stones had hands, so do you. Build accordingly. I think about that panel when I think about the 4 days of the Ascendancy's return. I think about the woman who commissioned it, her 4 names, the writing tradition she used, the fact that someone from 11,000 years deep in the seawall's history looked ahead and imagined a reader they would never know, and wrote something honest for them. I think about the patience in that. The specific, difficult, unglamorous patience of people who are not trying to be remembered but are trying to be useful. The Ascendancy fleet departed on the morning of the 5th day. The departure was not abrupt, not a retreat, not an expulsion. The fleet commander had requested time. He had been given time. He had spent those days in study and in conversation with the diplomatic continuity team and, on the final evening, in a long solo session at the seaward rail of the crown platform that none of our people attended because he had privacy, and we had given it to him. When he came in from the rail, he was carrying something in his expression that the Veth physiognomy makes difficult to read for humans, but that I had by then spent 4 days training myself to interpret. What he was carrying looked like what the panels call grief. Not grief for a loss exactly, grief for a misunderstanding. The specific heaviness of people who have discovered that something they believed for a very long time was not what they thought. His final formal communication before departure was to Coordinator Okafor Schenk. He told her that Ascendancy would take the record home. He meant the panel record, or rather the digital archive of it, a full copy that we had prepared and offered on the 2nd day. He said that the Ascendancy's scholars would spend what time was necessary with it. He said that he did not know what the Ascendancy's theology would look like when that study was complete, but that he believed it would be more accurate. He said, in the formal register that the translation system flagged as significant commitment being made, we will not come back to claim this world. We may come back to understand it, if you permit, but the claim is ended. Okafor said, "You are always welcome to understand us. We have been recording for a long time." The fleet rose through the cloud layers, slowly, maintaining the careful formation it had descended in, and the human warships held their escort positions until the ascendancy was clear of the inner system. No shots were fired. No warning was formally issued. No ultimatum was delivered. The record spoke for itself, as the record was always built to do, and the ascendancy listened to it. Really listened, not the way you listen to something you expect to confirm what you already believe, but the way you listen to something accepted that it knows more than you do. I was on the crown platform when they went. Most of the installation staff was. We stood at the rail in the early morning light and watched the formation climb until it was points of light, and then less than points, and then the sky was just the sky. OC was beside me again. He had the tea again. I honestly do not know where he keeps it, but I have stopped asking. He watched the last lights disappear and was quiet for a long time. "The panel commission is going to want a new entry," he said eventually. "They'll want it soon," I said, "before people start to forget the details." "They won't forget the details," he said. "That's the point of the panels." He was right about that. He is generally right about things, OC. 30 years on the seawall will do that to a person. We went back to work. The thermal housing issue on the upper crown had resolved itself overnight. Sometimes they do. But the follow-up on Cluster 740 was still pending, and there was a report from the morning shift that a section of panel mounting hardware near kilometer 580 was showing stress markers that needed physical inspection before the next storm system came through. Not glamorous work. Not the kind of work you would write a legend about. But the seawall runs on it, and the seawall has been running for 118,600 years, and that is not an accident of engineering. It is the accumulated result of ordinary people, doing ordinary work very carefully for a very long time, passing the habit down. My grandmother worked this installation. Her grandmother before her. I do not know how far back that line goes. We are not a family given to genealogical research, which is, if you think about it, somewhat ironic given what we maintain. But the habit persists, the care persists, the understanding that what you do today becomes part of the record, and the record is what lasts. I wrote my own panel entry a few months after the Ascendancy's departure. The panel commission had processed the formal historical record. The approach contacts, fleet designation markings, the 4 days of dialogue, the departure, the copy of the archive, and added it to the relevant sections of the seawall face. I wrote a personal entry in the supplemental record section that maintenance engineers are permitted to maintain. It is not a famous section. Most people who visit the seawalls ever find it. It runs in thin horizontal bands at mid-elevation in the maintenance access zones, full of entries by the people who spent their working lives on the structure and wanted to add their voices to the record without the formality of the official commission process. My entry is not long. I wrote, "They came back after 120,000 years, and they read what we left them, and they understood it, and they took it home." That seemed like enough. The record is not for brevity. Some things do not need more words than the truth requires. The seal housing on Cluster 740 has been holding steady for 4 months. The thermal housing issue has not recurred. The stress markers near kilometer 580 required a bracket replacement that took 2 days and is now logged in the maintenance archive, which will outlast both the bracket and me. Above it, the panels carry everything. They always have.